Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Friday to you. Hopefully you've had a good week. It is a gorgeous day across Acadiana here today with cool conditions and lots of sunshine out there too. And it looks like it's going to be a very, very nice weekend. Of course, we're going to go over what was Hurricane Helene, which is now a tropical storm, but the effects of that stretching from Central America to Cuba through Florida and much of the southeast, and still getting hammered in some areas across parts of the eastern sections of the U.S., particularly in parts of Tennessee, the Carolinas, and going into portions of Georgia. Right now, we are holding at 83 degrees here in the hub city. It feels like 83 because the humidity levels are nice and low at this point. The dew point at 59 and our relative humidity holding at 44%. Winds are currently out of the west at 7, and we've seen some gusts getting up to about 17 miles per hour. And as far as our pressure, it is starting to come up now at 29.80. Still breezy. You can see the Bro Bridge camera kind of shaking a little bit there in the wind, but there's plenty of sunshine out there, clear skies and comfortable conditions, and the roadways are dry. It really is a pretty day, and I think most of the weekend is going to be like this as well, although a couple of degrees warmer, but still, by Louisiana standards, this is some really, really fine weather. Check it out. The Gulf of Mexico is hurricane free right now as tropical storm Helene is now moved off toward the north. And out in the offshore waters, we still have some rough seas due to the tropical system and also due to a cold front that came through the day before yesterday. So things are going to be a little bit rough out there. The small craft advisory, I believe, has been dropped. It was supposed to expire during the early morning hours here at about 7 o'clock, and I believe that has happened, but the winds are running about 15 to 20, and they're going to be diminishing a little bit later on this afternoon. So boaters will probably have some better days coming up over the course of the weekend. I did want to show you, though, this St. George Island, Florida. Now, this is just about maybe 30 miles, 40 miles west of where the eye of the hurricane made landfall. So since they were on the west side, they took on some serious winds there. But the storm surge values were not as high because it was pushing in the offshore waters. So a much prettier day there on the beach there in St. George Island. Now, you go way farther inland to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and you can see it's a pretty shot there, and they're actually starting to get a little bit of sunshine to start to come in now, but they were hit very, very hard with heavy rains in much of Tennessee, the Carolinas, and Georgia, but still some very gusty winds there. But a great shot there in Gatlinburg, and I think things are going to be improving there. Check it out how huge what the cloud pattern is from what is left of Helene. It's now a tropical storm with winds at 45 miles per hour. The coordinates are there on the left-hand side of your screen, and there's still a considerable amount of rain. I'll kind of pull the radar out a little bit just to give you an idea of where we are. The center of circulation is kind of there over eastern Kentucky, maybe far western parts of West Virginia, but we are starting to see a lot of the rain pulling out of parts of the Smoky Mountains and into the Carolinas, and it looks like things are improving. Still got some rain, though, over central and middle parts of Tennessee, and then pushing up into Kentucky, you've got some heavy rains too. But those rains are going to continue, and they're flooding rains as well, and that's going to be causing some major problems. So this, considering it was a hurricane at Category 4 when it made landfall, you have to remember this thing ran all the way up the west coast of Florida. They had significant storm surge flooding from Fort Myers all the way up through Tampa, and then pushing up to around Cedar Key, and then the tremendous storm surge there in Appalachia Bay. And then as it continued to move inland, those hurricane force winds went about halfway across Georgia, and now we're talking about the issues with the flooding rains, and the low is going to eventually dissipate, and it's going to be kind of absorbed by an upper trough that's there over the middle part of the country. So it's going to sit and spin there for a few days, so the rain chances are going to stay kind of high, especially over parts of the Tennessee and the Ohio Valley. And check this out too. Remember when we had Hurricane Francine a few weeks ago? We had all the power outages really basically in South Louisiana and southwestern portions of Mississippi. So this is so much more widespread of a disaster. You can see the power outages there in at least 10 states. And if you look at the numbers there on the bottom, You're talking about maybe 3, 4, possibly 5 million customers. Now, these are customers. You have to remember these are households that are out of power. So, I mean, a household can have several people in it. So you're talking about millions of folks who are not going to have power here for a number of days. So as we move on, I hate to tell you that hurricane season doesn't end until November the 30th. And yes, we have other systems that are out there. We have what's now Hurricane Isaac, which is currently in the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean, and we now have newly formed Tropical Storm Joyce. So Isaac is up here and Joyce is out here. Both of those are no threat to the Acadiana region. So we'll go ahead and start with Isaac, which is going to hang out here in the middle part of the Atlantic at least for 3 or 4 days, but it is pushing eastward, and it's a hurricane right now with winds at 75 miles per hour, and will continue to move into the colder waters of the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean. Meanwhile, Joyce is brand new as a named storm, but it's kind of old school when it comes to the disturbance that's been out over the Atlantic. We've been watching this for about a week as it came off the African coast as a tropical wave, but at first we thought this was the one that was going to become Isaac, but then the blip that was in the northern part of the Atlantic got the name first. So second place gets Tropical Storm Joyce, and we think Joyce is just going to stay a tropical storm and meander there over the central part of the Atlantic Ocean. So no worries with that one right now. Now, we started to talk a little bit about this tropical wave yesterday that's now moving over the eastern part of the Caribbean. Remember, yesterday it was out here, and it's kind of a big blow up of thunderstorms. The National Hurricane Center didn't really seem to have much of it on its radar other than the fact that it was a tropical wave. But now we're starting to get in more of a 7-day window as this tropical wave and moisture is going to continue to kind of push off toward the west. Now, I've got a couple of models that are developing this tropical wave, and then I've got a couple of models that are taking this moisture over here into the western part of the Caribbean towards Central America, and then kind of messing around with that Central American Gyre that we talked about. And if you haven't heard of that, I do have a link below in the description. And basically what it is a large low pressure area that sits over Central America, kind of straddles the Pacific as well as the Atlantic. And by the way, this is Tropical Storm John. If you've been reading about John has decided to go ahead and blip around and visit every single city on the west coast of Mexico. It was a Category 3 at landfall, and it's been bouncing back and forth along the coast over the last several days. But getting back to the Central American Gyre, you get a big low pressure area that's out here, and around that big gyre here you get these disturbances that just kind of roll around them all the way around, and they kind of come up here around like that, and occasionally it can pull in some tropical moisture. This is basically what happened with Hurricane Helene just about a week ago. So there's the potential that we could see this system and the moisture that's coming in from the eastern Caribbean could either become a tropical system over the western Caribbean, or it could mix with that Central American Gyre and you get a low pressure to spin up. So we're kind of watching what's going to be happening out there. And the reason, again, why we're so concerned is because that's not a real great area for tropical weather to develop when it comes to what we are watching, because it's kind of in our neighborhood. And the tropical cyclone heat potential is still quite high, even with the recent passage of Hurricane Helene. The shear is relatively low now over the eastern part of the Caribbean, and I do think that what is part of that tropical wave here is going to be moving off toward the west, but this area of lower wind shear is probably going to kind of roll in tandem with that tropical system and work its way off toward the west. And then the future also shows some really low wind shear here over the central and southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. Now, there's troughiness that's going on here across much of the mid part of the country, and as we start to get into October, those fronts become a lot more progressive. But because of that and the Central American Gyre, which kind of amplifies a little bit more into October, sometimes it can tug these tropical systems northward toward the Gulf Coast. Most of the time in October, they curve around and head back over toward Florida, kind of like what Helene did. But we'll kind of have to wait and see what happens. So models yesterday had some hints of some lower pressure over the western Caribbean and the Bay of Campeche. So we let the GFS kind of run out 10 days. And it's got a little minor tropical system that seems to want to develop there over the north central part of the Gulf of Mexico that could affect the central part of the northern Gulf Coast, including Louisiana. The Euro model, which usually is pretty conservative when it comes to developing tropical systems in the early stage like this, has also got a bit of a trough, kind of building there over Central America, and then maybe a bit of a low pressure area kind of cruising its way into Mexico. But again, that Central American gyre kind of throwing a couple of things around and around and around. So when you see that last part of the run there, you start to see kind of a lower pressure area over parts of the western part of the Bay of Campeche here, but then you start to get another low that kind of develops there and starts to pull into parts of the Gulf of Mexico. So very uncertain on what we're going to be seeing there, but what we could probably say is we're expecting some pressures to start to lower, and the moisture is going to start to build as well. Now, the Canadian model does it a little bit different, and the Canadian model actually develops the tropical wave as it's moving here across the Caribbean Sea, and you get an actual low pressure area here over the western part of the Caribbean, and then it starts to work its way into parts of the Gulf of Mexico. So this is taking us out until about Saturday or Sunday of next week. So by the time we get into next weekend, we may be talking about something in the Gulf of Mexico, but really this is not going to be a concern over this weekend. Just kind of check in over the course of the weekend to see what we've got going on. And the ICON model doesn't quite go as far out as the other global models. This one only goes out 10 days, but you can see there in the western part of the Caribbean, southern part of the Bay of Campeche, as you get toward the latter part of that run, you get a bit of a low pressure area trying to develop there as we get into the early part of next weekend. So again, nothing to worry about here in the near term future. I think today, tomorrow, Sunday, even Monday, we really don't need to be concerned about it, but I think it's something that we're probably going to have to watch here as we go into the early part of next week. And the tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center, now that we're starting to get within about 7 days of where we could see some development, either from a tropical wave or perhaps a combination of that and some energy from the Central American Gyre. But you can see there's a low-end chance, at least over the western part of the Caribbean and the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico going into the next 7 days, where we could have some tropical development. And then over where you see Joyce, you have another area right in here that's separate from Joyce, but this is another tropical wave that's over by the Cape Verde Islands. And some of the models have been kind of indicating some activity out there as well. So the tropical weather outlook for the next 7 days looks relatively busy. And I've shown you this global tropics hazard outlook map going into the following week, starting on the 2nd, going through the middle part of the following week. You can see that the activity possibilities are moderate to high there as you get into the Gulf of Mexico, Western Caribbean, and central part of the Atlantic. And then even going into the following week after that, October 9th through the 15th, you still have a moderate chance for some development over the Western Caribbean, southern Gulf of Mexico, and more of a lower end, but it's not zero, out in the central part of the Atlantic Ocean. So that's one of the things that I've been a little bit concerned about as we've gone through hurricane season with the numbers that were predicted early on and the onset of La Nina toward the end of the season, which is just now starting to pull in. We were thinking it was going to maybe pull in more in August and bring a very, very busy September, but it hasn't really showed its face, and it's not a super strong La Nina either. But if we have that, there's a chance that we could see a busier September, October rather than August, September like we would normally do. So don't let your guard down yet. Remember that hurricane season doesn't end until November 30th officially, but here along the northern Gulf Coast, we usually can start taking a break from this as we turn the page from October going into November. But as we turn the page to October, you can see that there are a number of tropical systems that tend to develop over the western part of the Caribbean and the southeastern Gulf of Mexico. And some of those do make their way toward the northern Gulf Coast. We've been hit a number of times over the last several years. A big one that comes to mind is Hurricane Lily back in 2002. That was a monster storm, and we got really lucky because it weakened before it made its way on land here in Louisiana. And then, of course, the busy season of 2020, we had both Hurricanes Delta and Zeta come in during the month of October. So even though October hurricanes are a little less common than what you're going to see in August and September, we've had our fair shares. And oh, by the way, I found a tweet that was earlier today that when Hurricane Helene made landfall as a major hurricane, I believe it said it was the 9th major hurricane to strike the Gulf Coast since 2017. And prior to 2017, the last Category 3 or higher hurricane was Wilma in 2005. So we went 12 years without a major hurricane striking the Gulf Coast between 2005 and 2017. And since 2017, we've had 9 major hurricanes hit. So that's kind of a scary number to think about. And it's not just reserved for Florida, and it's not just reserved for Louisiana. There have been strikes on every state: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, as well as Florida. So again, hurricane season is not over yet. Well, we've run about 17 minutes here on this Friday, so I'd love to let you go early on this weekend. Thank you for joining me and picking up, even though we don't have anything active right now locally. I really appreciate everyone who's decided to subscribe and also join for this live broadcast, and for those of you who watch the broadcast later on replay. In between any tropical systems and any updates over the course of the weekend, I will, of course, put those on my social media pages, and if you want to follow those, the pages are right there at Meteorologist Dave Baker on Facebook, and my handle for X is at Dave Baker TV. I hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy the weather. It's going to be fantastic, and I will see you on Monday.